I was sitting in a sterile waiting room, the cold smell of antiseptic burning the back of my throat, when I realized that the man I'd been seeing for 3 months didn't just disagree with my life choices, he thought he could override them. He called me aggressive for wanting control over my own body. He called my entire future a small disagreement. But as I looked at the consent forms for the clinical procedure that would change my life forever, the real shock wasn't the surgery itself. It was how far someone who claims to care about you will go to convince you that your no is actually just a maybe. It makes you wonder, doesn't it? At what point does a romantic connection become a hostage situation for your personal values? And why is it that when a woman knows exactly what she wants, the world, and the men in it, suddenly decide she's just being difficult? To understand how I ended up sitting in that chair, clutching a clipboard while my phone blew up with increasingly desperate texts, we have to go back to the beginning. Back to when Ben was just a profile on a screen and a series of likes that seemed too good to be true. I'm 30 years old. In the world of modern dating, 30 is a strange milestone. It's the age where the casual, let's see where this goes, energy starts to shift into something more urgent. People start looking at you like a ticking clock. But for me, 30 was the year of clarity. I've known for a long time that the traditional path, the white picket fence, the minivan, the sleepless nights, and the lifelong commitment of raising a child, wasn't for me. It's not that I hate kids, it's just that I love my life without them. I love the silence of my apartment on a Sunday morning. I love being able to travel at a moment's notice. I love my career, and most importantly, I love the person I am when I'm not stretched thin by the demands of motherhood. My dating profile was a reflection of that. It wasn't hidden in some "about me" section that nobody reads. It was right there in the hard data points. Children. Doesn't have. Doesn't want. It was my filter, my shield against wasting anyone's time. Then I swiped on Ben. He was 32, handsome in a rugged, approachable way, with a smile that reached his eyes and a bio that talked about hiking, craft beer, and his golden retriever. I looked at his stats. Children, doesn't have, open to kids. In my mind, open to kids is the grey area of dating. It usually means, if it happens, cool. If it doesn't, that's cool too. It's the let's see what my partner wants stance. Since I was a firm no, I figured if we hit it off, he'd just land on my side of the fence. It was a small detail at the time, overshadowed by the fact that he actually knew how to hold a conversation and didn't send a "hey" as an opening line. Our first 4 dates were, honestly, incredible. We had this easy, electric chemistry that you usually only see in movies. We'd talk for hours over coffee, then over dinner, then over drinks. He was attentive. He remembered the name of my childhood cat and the specific way I like my steak cooked. He made me feel seen in a way I hadn't felt in years. By the 4th date, I was starting to let my guard down. I was thinking, maybe this is it. Maybe I finally found someone who fits. But there was always this tiny, nagging voice in the back of my head. We hadn't talked about the big stuff yet. We were still in the honeymoon phase where everything is light and airy. But at 30, you know that the light and airy stuff is just the frosting. The cake is made of values, lifestyle, and long-term goals. I knew I couldn't let it go much longer. I didn't want to be 6 months deep into a relationship only to find out we were building on a fault line. So, the 5th date. We went to this cozy little Italian place, the kind with dim lighting and red checkered tablecloths. The air smelled like garlic and expensive wine. Ben looked great. He was wearing this dark navy sweater that made his eyes pop, and he was telling a story about a mishap at work that had me laughing so hard I could barely breathe. But as the laughter died down and we waited for our entrees, the atmosphere shifted. It was time. I decided to circle back to our profiles, using it as a springboard for a deeper conversation. I mentioned how much I appreciated that we were both on the same page about most things. But then I brought it up. I asked him specifically about his stance on children. I reminded him that my profile was very clear. I didn't want them. Ever. I watched him take a sip of his wine, his expression remaining calm, almost dismissive. He told me, quite simply, that he'd always seen himself as a father. He said he hadn't ever really considered not having any. It was like he was saying he'd always assumed the sky was blue. It was a fundamental truth of his existence. My heart sank a little, but I stayed firm. I told him, as gently as I could, that I had no plans to change my life. I explained my child-free lifestyle, the freedom I cherished, and the fact that I simply didn't have that maternal itch. He didn't get angry. He didn't even look concerned. Instead, he smiled, this patronizing, "Oh, you're so cute" kind of smile, and said, "You know, I bet our kids would be the cutest things ever. You'd be such a natural." It felt like a physical blow to the stomach. I opened my mouth to respond, to tell him that he wasn't listening. But right then, the waiter arrived with 2 steaming plates of pasta. The conversation was severed. We ate in a sort of heavy silence, the "cute kids" comment hanging over the table like a thick fog. Ben acted like nothing had happened. He went back to talking about his dog, about the weather, about a movie he wanted to see. But I couldn't shake it. He hadn't heard a word I said. He'd heard my "no" and translated it into, "She just hasn't met the right guy to change her mind yet." I went home that night, feeling a deep sense of unease. The chemistry was still there, but the foundation was cracked. I spent the next few days in a daze, playing the conversation back in my head. I realized that if I didn't address this now, I was complicit in the misunderstanding. I was letting him believe in a future that was never going to happen. A few days later, the text came. He'd noticed I'd been a bit quieter, a bit more distant. He asked if it was the kid topic from dinner. I took a deep breath, my thumbs hovering over the keyboard. This was it. I told him that I'd been thinking a lot about our conversation and that I didn't think we were aligned for the long term. I told him that since he definitely wanted children and I definitely didn't, it wouldn't be fair to continue. I didn't want to lead him on. I thought I was being mature. I thought I was being kind. I wasn't prepared for the explosion that followed. The vibration of my phone on the nightstand felt like a physical jolt. I remember staring at the screen, watching his name pop up over and over again. It wasn't just one text. It was a cascade, a flood of words that felt like he was trying to drown out my reality with his expectations. Ben wasn't just upset. He was offended. It was as if, by stating my boundary, I had personally insulted his entire vision of the future. His first response was a classic deflection. He told me that he would never date someone who already had kids, but he'd always just assumed, there's that word again, assumed, that any woman he dated would eventually want them. It was such a strange, narrow way of looking at the world. He saw children not as a choice, but as an inevitable milestone of a successful relationship. To him, my no wasn't a personality trait or a life path. It was a temporary glitch in the system that he figured would just sort itself out once we fell in love. But then, he pivoted. He started telling me that it was too early for these kinds of deep conversations. He said we should have waited. And that's when the first real wave of frustration hit me. Too early? We were 5 dates in. We were at the exact point where you decide if someone is worth your time, your energy, and your heart. When exactly is the right time to tell someone you're never going to give them the one thing they've always wanted? 6 months in? A year? After we've moved in together and our lives are so intertwined that a breakup feels like an amputation? To Ben, too early was code for, I haven't had enough time to convince you yet. He wanted to build up enough emotional equity so that when the topic came up again, I'd feel too guilty or too attached to walk away. It felt predatory in a weirdly domestic way. He wasn't looking for a partner. He was looking for a project. I tried to stay calm. I sat on the edge of my bed, the late afternoon sun casting long orange shadows across the floor, and I typed out a response that I thought would end it once and for all. I told him that for me, this wasn't just a preference, it was a deal breaker. And then I dropped the bombshell. I told him that I was already taking medical steps to ensure that I would never be able to have children. I was moving forward with a permanent procedure. I thought that would be the end of it. I thought that once the biological possibility was off the table, he'd realise there was no maybe left to cling to. But instead of backing off, he doubled down. He got even more upset, and that's when the analogy started. He compared my decision to him asking me to move across the country. He told me that life isn't black and white, and that there are pros and cons to everything. He said the topic was layered, and that we knew so little about each other. Don't throw away the whole relationship over a small disagreement, he wrote. A small disagreement. I stared at those words until they blurred. A small disagreement is what movie to watch on a Friday night, or whether we should get Thai food or pizza. Bringing a literal human being into the world, dedicating 20+ years of your life to their upbringing, and fundamentally altering your physical, emotional, and financial reality is not a small disagreement. It is the biggest agreement two people can ever make. The fact that he saw it as something we could compromise on was terrifying. How do you compromise on a child? You can't have half a kid. You either have one or you don't. And in every scenario where a couple compromises on children, one person ends up resentful. Either the person who didn't want them feels trapped, or the person who did feels hollow. There is no middle ground. But Ben didn't see it that way. He saw my surgery as an act of defiance, something I was doing to him rather than for myself. He told me I was drawing an aggressive line for us. Aggressive. That word stuck in my throat. Why is it that when a man knows what he wants, he's driven or focused, but when a woman sets a firm boundary, she's aggressive? I wasn't attacking him. I was simply protecting the life I had worked so hard to build. He started pushing for an in-person meeting. He said we hadn't built enough of a relationship for me to truly hear him. He wanted to look me in the eye and use that chemistry we had to bypass my logic. He thought that if he could just get me in a room, if he could just make me laugh one more time or touch my hand, he could make the child-free version of me disappear. It was a power play, plain and simple. He was trying to frame my certainty as a lack of communication. He wanted to continue the conversation, but there was no conversation left to have. I had given him my answer. He just didn't like the one I picked. I remember sitting there, feeling the weight of his expectations pressing down on me through the phone. I started to wonder if I was the crazy one. I mean, we did have great chemistry. He was a great guy on paper. Was I being too rigid? Was I throwing away something special because of a hypothetical future? But then I thought about the procedure. I thought about the relief I felt every time I took a step closer to making it official. That relief was my truth. It was louder than his frustration, louder than the cute kids' comments, and louder than the fear of being alone. I realised that Ben didn't actually like me. He liked the version of me he had invented in his head, the version that was open to his influence. The moment I proved I wasn't that person, I became the villain in his story. I stayed up late that night, scrolling back through our old texts, the flirty banter, the jokes, the plans for the upcoming weekend. It all felt like it belonged to a different person. I saw the red flags I had missed, the way he'd steer the conversation back to himself, the subtle ways he'd dismiss my opinions on smaller things. It was all there, hidden under the surface of nice guy charm. The next morning, I woke up with a heavy heart, but a clear head. I knew what I had to do. I couldn't go to that in-person meeting. I knew what would happen. He'd talk, I'd listen, he'd try to make me feel guilty for giving up on us, and I'd leave feeling drained and misunderstood. I needed to end it once and for all, but Ben wasn't making it easy. He was already texting again, asking what time he could come over. He was acting like the previous night's argument was just a speed bump, something we'd laugh about at our wedding one day. The level of delusion was staggering. I took a long shower, letting the hot water wash away the lingering anxiety. I looked at myself in the mirror, really looked at myself. I saw a woman who knew her mind. I saw someone who wasn't willing to set herself on fire to keep someone else warm. I picked up my phone and started typing. I knew this would be the final exchange. I knew that after this, there would be no more what-ifs. I just had to be strong enough to hit send. The thing about people like Ben is that they have a very specific vision of how a reasonable person should act. And in his world, a reasonable person is someone who is always willing to negotiate their own soul for the sake of a quiet life. He kept calling me aggressive, and I had to sit with that word for a long time. I looked it up, not because I didn't know what it meant, but because I wanted to see if I could find even a shred of truth in his accusation. Aggressive, ready or likely to attack or confront. Was I attacking him? No, I was defending a boundary. But to a man who expects every door to be open to him, a locked one feels like an assault. To Ben, my certainty was an act of violence against his ego. He couldn't wrap his head around the fact that I wasn't leaving room for growth, which, in his mind, was just a synonym for submission. I decided right then that I wasn't going to meet him in person. I knew exactly how that would go. He'd pick a public place, somewhere where I'd feel pressured to keep my voice down and maintain appearances. He'd lean across the table, take my hand, and use that "we have such a connection" voice. He'd talk about potential and layers and the beauty of the unknown. He'd try to make my biological reality feel like a philosophical debate. He wanted to turn my life into a pros and cons list, as if the decision to remain child-free was something you could solve with a spreadsheet. So I picked up my phone. My hands were shaking, but not from fear. It was adrenaline. The kind you feel when you're finally stepping out of a cage you didn't even realize you were in. I texted him back. I told him that an in-person meeting wouldn't change the outcome. I told him that my decision to undergo a permanent procedure, a bilateral salpingectomy to be specific, wasn't a spur-of-the-moment whim. It was the result of years of self-reflection. I told him that if he truly saw himself as a father, then we were fundamentally incompatible. There was no middle ground where we both got what we wanted. If we stayed together, one of us would eventually have to sacrifice our entire identity for the other. I told him I wasn't willing to do that, and I didn't want him to have to do it either. I thought that was fair. I thought that was the most honest thing I could possibly say. But Ben's response was a masterclass in gaslighting. He told me I was being short-sighted. He said that I was throwing away something real for something hypothetical. He even had the audacity to say that by getting the surgery, I was taking away his choice, too. Take a second to think about that. He actually believed that my medical decisions, my internal organs, and my future health were somehow a collective resource that he should have a vote in. We had been on 5 dates. 5! We hadn't even shared a toothbrush, yet he felt entitled to the contents of my uterus. It was in that moment that the last bit of nice guy Ben evaporated. The mask didn't just slip, it shattered. He started accusing me of hiding my true self from him. He said I'd tricked him by being so likable and fun while harboring this radical agenda. He actually used the word radical. Since when is knowing what you want for your own life radical? I realized then that the chemistry we had wasn't a bridge. It was a distraction. It was the shiny wrapper on a gift that, once opened, was completely empty. He didn't want a partner. He wanted a co-star for the movie he'd already written in his head. and I was failing my audition because I refused to follow the script. I felt this strange mixture of grief and relief. Grief for the person I thought he was, the guy who liked hiking and craft beer and made me laugh until my sides ached. And relief because I was seeing the real Ben now, before I had invested years of my life into him. I was seeing the man who would have spent our entire marriage waiting for me to change my mind, growing more resentful with every passing year that a baby didn't appear. I was seeing the man who would have looked at me on my 40th birthday, not with love, but with the disappointment of a man who'd been cheated out of a legacy. He sent one last long paragraph. He told me that I was cold. He said that I lacked feminine warmth and that I was shutting down the possibility of a family because of my own selfishness. He told me that one day I'd wake up alone and regret being so stubborn. It's funny, isn't it? When a woman chooses herself, the world's first instinct is to tell her she'll be lonely, as if being alone is a fate worse than being with someone who doesn't respect your basic autonomy, as if a house full of noise and toys is the only way to avoid a hollow life. I didn't argue with him. I didn't try to explain that my life was already full. I didn't tell him about my friends who are like sisters, or the career I'm passionate about, or the quiet Saturday mornings that feel like a prayer. I didn't tell him that family doesn't have to mean biological children, that it can mean a chosen community of people who actually see you for who you are. I simply typed, "I wish you the best in finding the future you're looking for. It just won't be with me." And then I did the one thing he didn't think I had the nerve to do. I blocked him. I sat there in the silence of my room for a long time. The ding of the phone was gone. The pressure was gone. The orange shadows had turned to deep purple as the sun went down. I felt lighter than I had in weeks. But as I sat there, I started thinking about the AITAH of it all. I knew there would be people, maybe even some of you watching this, who would think I was too harsh. People who would say, "He just wanted to talk," or "You should have given him a chance to process it." But how many chances do you give someone to tell you that your no doesn't matter? How many conversations do you have to endure where your life goals are treated like a debate topic? I went to my surgery consultation a few days later. I sat in that sterile waiting room, the one I mentioned at the very beginning. I looked around at the other women there. Some looked nervous, some looked determined, some looked tired. And I realized that every single one of us was there to take back a piece of ourselves that the world keeps trying to claim. The doctor called my name. I stood up, clutched my clipboard, and walked through the door. I wasn't being aggressive. I wasn't being cold. I was being certain. And for the first time in my life, I realized that certainty is the most powerful thing a woman can possess. But the story didn't end with the surgery, because a few weeks later, while I was recovering and feeling more at peace than ever, I got a notification on a different app. A friend request from a burner account. Ben wasn't done. He had one more layered conversation he wanted to force me into. Recovery is a strange time. It's a period where your world shrinks down to the size of your bedroom, the temperature of your heating pad, and the rhythm of your own breath. After my procedure, I felt a profound sense of peace. A physical weight had been lifted, even as I dealt with the temporary discomfort of the surgery itself. I spent those first few days in a cocoon of soft blankets and Netflix marathons, sipping ginger tea and finally feeling like my future was entirely my own. There was no more what if. There was only what is. But that peace was shattered on the fourth day. I was lying on the sofa, half asleep, when my phone chimed. It wasn't a text. I had blocked Ben's number after all. It was a notification from Instagram. A new message request from an account with no profile picture and a handle that was just a string of random numbers. I knew before I even opened it. My stomach did a nervous flip that had nothing to do with my surgery. The message started with, "I know you blocked me, but I couldn't just let things end like that. It's Ben. Please don't delete this until you read it." I felt a surge of cold fury. The audacity of creating a burner account to bypass a boundary was so on brand for him, but I almost had to laugh. But the laughter didn't come. Instead, I felt a creeping sense of dread. This wasn't fighting for love. This was a refusal to accept a no. This was a man who believed his need to be heard was more important than my right to be left alone. I read on, my eyes scanning the blocks of text. He had pivoted again. Now he was playing the victim. He talked about how blindsided he was, how he'd spent the last few days in a dark place, trying to understand how I could be so disposable with our connection. He said he'd spoken to his sister about it, and even she thought I was being extreme. That's a classic tactic, isn't it? Bringing in an imaginary or real jury to validate your perspective. "See, even my sister thinks you're the crazy one." He went on to say that he'd done some research on the procedure I'd had. He told me that reversals are possible or that IVF is always an option later. He was literally trying to find loopholes in my own body. He was looking for ways to undo the very thing I had done to protect my future. He said, "I'm not saying we have to have kids now, or even in 5 years. I'm just saying we shouldn't close the door on something that could be so beautiful." The door he was talking about was my autonomy. He was standing in the hallway, banging on the wood, demanding I let him in so he could rearrange the furniture. I didn't reply. I didn't even block the burner account immediately. I just sat there, staring at the screen, feeling this intense realization. Ben didn't love me. He didn't even like me. He liked the idea of me as a vessel for his legacy. He liked the version of me that would eventually mature and settle down. He saw my child-free life as a phase, a youthful rebellion that he was supposed to gently guide me out of, and because I had taken a permanent step to ensure that would never happen, I had destroyed the fantasy he was projecting onto me. His anger wasn't about losing me. It was about losing the power to change me. I realized then that this is why so many people, especially women, get stuck in these cycles. We're taught that persistence is romantic. We're taught that if a man fights for us, it means he cares. Movies tell us that the guy who stands outside the window with a boombox or follows the girl to the airport is the hero. But in real life, the guy who follows you to the airport after you told him to stay home isn't a hero. He's a person who doesn't respect your boundaries. I thought about all the small disagreements he'd mentioned. If we had stayed together, what would have been next? Would he have disagreed with my career choices? Would he have disagreed with how I spent my money? When someone shows you that they don't respect your no on the biggest issue possible, they are telling you they won't respect your no on anything. I finally felt the strength to hit block again. But then, an hour later, an email landed in my inbox. Subject: "Can we just talk?" He was moving through every digital avenue he had. It felt like a siege. I was sitting in my own home, recovering from surgery, and I felt like I was being hunted by a nice guy in a navy sweater. In the email, he changed his tone again. He was angry now. He called me cruel for blocking him without a proper conversation. He said I was cowardly for hiding behind a screen. He said he deserved closure. Closure. That's the ultimate weapon of the entitled dater, isn't it? "I need closure" usually translates to, "I need you to listen to me tell you why you're wrong until I feel better." Closure is something you give yourself. It's not a gift your ex-partner is required to wrap up and hand to you, especially when you've spent the last week disrespecting their wishes. I realized that if I responded, even to say, "leave me alone," I was giving him what he wanted. I was feeding the monster. Every response is a coin in the machine, and as long as I kept providing them, he'd keep playing. I closed my laptop. I put my phone in the other room. I walked back to my bed, slowly and carefully, mindful of the stitches and the lingering soreness in my abdomen. I laid down and looked at the ceiling. I thought about the Reddit post I'd written. I'd asked, "Are you attached?" Because in the heat of the moment, his gaslighting had worked. He'd made me feel like I was being aggressive and cold. But as the silence of my apartment settled around me, I realized that my coldness was actually just clarity. My aggression was just self-preservation. I wasn't the asshole for ending a relationship that had no future. I wasn't the asshole for refusing to debate my right to not be a mother. If anything, I was the one who had been honest from day one. He was the one who had lied, maybe even to himself, about being open to a child-free partner. I spent that night wondering how many other women had been bent. How many had started out firm in their convictions, only to be wore down by layered conversations and potential, and we have such a connection. How many children are in this world right now because their mothers were told that their no was just a maybe that hadn't met the right man yet? The thought made me shiver. I reached down and touched the bandage on my stomach. It was a small, physical reminder that I had won. I had protected myself. I had closed the door and locked it, and no amount of burner accounts or closure-seeking emails could change that. But Ben wasn't finished, because the next day, there was a knock at my door. The sound of a knock at the door is usually a mundane thing, isn't it? A package delivery, a neighbour asking for a cup of sugar, a friend dropping by unannounced. But when you're 4 days post-op, clutching a pillow to your abdomen because even a sneeze feels like your insides are being rearranged, and you've spent the last 48 hours blocking every digital avenue of a man who won't take no for an answer, that knock sounds like a gunshot. I froze on my sofa. My heart, which had finally started to settle into a steady rhythm of recovery, began to hammer against my ribs. I looked at the clock. It was 2 p.m. on a Tuesday. I wasn't expecting anyone. My mum had already been by that morning to drop off groceries, and my best friend wasn't coming over until after work. The knock came again, louder this time, insistent. I stood up slowly, the muscles in my core protesting every inch of the movement. I shuffled to the door, my breath coming in shallow hitches. I didn't want to look through the peephole. Part of me wanted to just crawl back into bed and pretend I didn't exist. But the curiosity and the fear was stronger. I leaned forward and squinted through the tiny glass lens. And there he was, Ben. He wasn't wearing the navy sweater today. He was in a grey hoodie, his hands shoved deep into his pockets, his shoulders hunched. He looked pathetic. That's the only word for it. He looked like a man who had spent the last 3 days convinced he was the protagonist of a tragic romance, rather than the villain of a very real boundary crossing. "I know you're in there," he said through the wood. His voice was muffled, but I could hear the tremor in it. "Please, just 5 minutes. I just need 5 minutes of your time, face to face. You owe me that much." The phrase, "you owe me," sent a chill down my spine that was colder than the hospital bed I'd been in just days prior. It's a phrase used by people who believe that time spent together is a currency that buys them ownership over you. 5 dates. We had spent maybe 15 hours together in total, and yet, in his mind, those 15 hours had earned him a seat at the table of my most private life decisions. I didn't open the door. I didn't even unlock the deadbolt. I just leaned my forehead against the cool wood and spoke as firmly as I could. "Ben, go home. I've told you it's over. I've told you I don't want to talk. You're at my house, uninvited. This is stalking. Leave, or I'm calling the police." There was a long silence on the other side. I could almost feel his frustration radiating through the door. I expected him to shout. I expected him to call me aggressive or cold again. But instead, he started to cry. It was a wet, heavy sound. He started talking about how he'd never felt a connection like ours. He talked about how he'd told his parents about me. He talked about how he'd already imagined us taking his dog to the park with our kids. He was grieving a future that had never existed, a future I had explicitly told him was off the table from the very first minute he looked at my dating profile. It was one of the most manipulative things I've ever experienced. He was using his own sadness as a weapon, trying to make me feel like I was the one hurting him by existing as my own person. He wanted me to open the door, comfort him, and tell him that maybe, just maybe, I'd change my mind. He wanted me to trade my autonomy for his comfort. I realized then that this is the trap of the nice guy. A bad guy would have kicked the door in or shouted insults. A nice guy stands on your porch and weeps until you feel so guilty that you let him back into your life. It's just a different form of control. It's the velvet glove over the iron fist. "Ben," I said, my voice shaking now, not from fear, but from an overwhelming sense of violation. "You're not listening to me. You have never listened to me. You're in love with a version of me that doesn't exist. The real me doesn't want kids. The real me got surgery so I can't have kids. And the real me wants you to get off my property right now." The crying stopped instantly. It was like someone had flipped a switch. "You're a monster," he spat. The voice wasn't muffled anymore. It was sharp, clear, and filled with a genuine, terrifying vitriol. "You're broken. What kind of woman does that to herself? You're so obsessed with your freedom that you've turned yourself into a dead end. You're going to die alone in this house, and you'll deserve it." The words should have hurt. They were designed to cut deep into the core of every societal pressure put on women since the beginning of time. The dead end. The dying alone. The idea that a woman's value is tied entirely to her ability to reproduce. But as I stood there, clutching my surgical pillow, I didn't feel hurt. I felt a weird, exhilarating sense of confirmation. Every word he screamed confirmed that I had made the right choice. He didn't see me as a human being. He saw me as a biological machine that had malfunctioned because I refused to produce what he wanted. I didn't say another word. I walked back to my sofa, picked up my phone, and I did exactly what I said I would do. I called the non-emergency police line. I told them there was a man on my porch who refused to leave and was shouting at my door. I watched through the window, hidden behind the curtains, as the patrol car pulled up 10 minutes later. I watched the officers talk to him. I watched Ben try to play the concerned boyfriend role at first. I could see him gesturing toward the house, looking worried. But then one of the officers looked at his notepad, probably seeing that I had reported him as an ex-date who had been blocked on everything. The officers didn't buy his act. They told him to leave. They told him that if he came back, he'd be arrested for trespassing. I watched him get into his car, his face twisted in a scowl that I'll never forget. The nice guy was gone. The rugged, smiling man from the dating profile was a ghost. All that was left was a bitter, entitled stranger who thought he was owed a woman's life. After they left, the silence in my house was different. It wasn't the quiet of recovery anymore. It was the silence of a victory. I spent the next few hours thinking about how close I had come to letting him stay in my life. If I hadn't been so firm on that 5th date, if I had waited like he wanted, I might have been months or even years into a relationship with that man before his true colours came out. I might have wasted the best years of my life trying to compromise with someone who viewed my basic identity as a disagreement. I realised that the reason I felt so aggressive to him was because I was the first person to tell him no and mean it. He had spent 32 years in a world that told him he could have whatever he wanted if he was just nice enough or persistent enough. I was the glitch in his matrix. I was the woman who couldn't be bought, persuaded, or guilted into a life I didn't want. But as I lay there, finally drifting off into a nap, I started thinking about the bigger picture. I thought about the thousands of women who are told every day that they are cold or selfish for choosing a child-free life. I thought about the men who think they can fix us. And I realised that my story wasn't just about a bad date with a guy named Ben. It was about the moment you realise that your life belongs to you, and you alone. It's about the power of the word no. And it's about the fact that sometimes the most feminine thing you can do is stand your ground and refuse to be anyone's version of perfect except your own. I woke up a few hours later to a text from my best friend. She was on her way over with takeout and a movie. I smiled. My life was full. My house was quiet. My future was clear. And as for Ben, well, he was right about one thing. I am a dead end. A dead end for his entitlement, a dead end for his expectations, and a dead end for any man who thinks my body is a topic for debate. And honestly, that felt like the best possible place to be. The silence that follows a police siren is a heavy, ringing kind of quiet. It's the sound of a boundary finally being enforced by something stronger than just your own voice. As I watched the tail lights of Ben's car disappear around the corner, followed by the slow, steady crawl of the patrol car, I felt a strange, hollow sensation in my chest. It wasn't regret. It was the sudden, sharp realization of just how dangerous a polite man can be when he's told his desires don't outweigh your reality. I sat back down on the sofa, my body trembling with a mixture of leftover adrenaline and physical exhaustion. My recovery had been hijacked by a man who couldn't handle the word no, and I could feel the toll it was taking. My core ached, a dull, throbbing reminder of the surgery that had started all of this. I pulled my blanket tighter around my shoulders, trying to reclaim the space that Ben had just tried to invade. My living room, which had always been my sanctuary, felt tainted. His voice still seemed to echo off the walls, the crying, the pleading, and then that final, venomous transformation into the man who called me a dead end. I picked up my phone, my thumb hovering over the Reddit app. I had posted my story there in a moment of utter confusion, looking for a reality check. I wanted to know if I was the monster Ben said I was. I wanted to know if being aggressive about my own life was really a sin. When I opened the thread, my heart skipped a beat. It had exploded. Thousands of comments, hundreds of shared stories, and a sea of perspectives that I wasn't prepared for. There were the people who cheered me on, women who had been through the same benning and had come out the other side. They talked about their own surgeries, their own deal-breaker conversations, and the liberation of finally owning their futures. But then there were the others, the ones who mirrored Ben's rhetoric. They called me selfish. They said I should have compromised. One commenter even wrote, "Why date at all if you're going to be so rigid? You're wasting men's time." I stared at that comment for a long time. Wasting men's time. As if my entire existence was a service that had failed to meet its quota. As if my 30 years of life, my career, my friendships, and my own happiness were secondary to the time of a man I'd seen 5 times. It was a perfect encapsulation of the entitlement I had just faced on my front porch. To these people, a woman's rigidity is just another word for her having standards that they can't meet. But then my best friend Sarah arrived. She didn't knock like Ben did. She used her key, announcing herself with a cheerful, "It's just me," and the smell of spicy basil noodles. She saw my face, pale, tear-streaked, and exhausted, and she didn't ask questions. She just set the food down, tucked the blanket around my legs, and sat on the floor next to the sofa. "He came here, didn't he?" she asked softly. I nodded, the lump in my throat finally breaking. I told her everything. The burner accounts, the emails, the sobbing on the porch, and the final, ugly transition into the man who hated me for my autonomy. I told her about the police and the way he looked when he was forced to leave. Sarah listened in that way only a true friend can, without judgment, without trying to fix it, just witnessing the weight of it. When I finished, she took a long sip of her water and looked at me with a ferocity that made me feel stronger just by being near her. "You know what Ben is," she said. "He's a ghost hunter. He's in love with the ghost of the woman he wants you to be. He's not in love with you, the person sitting here. He's in love with the version of you that serves his narrative. And when you proved you weren't a ghost, when you proved you were a real, solid person with a real, solid no, he couldn't handle it. He didn't lose a girlfriend today because he never had you. He lost a fantasy." Her words hit me like a revelation. She was right. Ben's love was conditional on my submission. It was a contract I had never signed, written in a language I didn't speak. We spent the rest of the evening talking about the biological clock myth and the way society treats child-free women like they're waiting rooms for a life that hasn't started yet. We talked about how open to kids on a dating profile is often a trap, a way for people to bypass the filter and try to negotiate later. It's like someone saying they're open to moving when they actually have an ancestral home they'll never leave, Sarah joked, trying to lighten the mood. They just want to get you in the door so they can convince you to pack your bags. But as we laughed, I couldn't help but think about Ben's sister. He'd mentioned that even she thought I was being extreme. It made me wonder about the women in his life. Were they happy, or had they simply compromised until there was nothing left of their original selves? Had they been told that their no was just a maybe for so long that they eventually started to believe it? The next few days were a blur of healing. The physical pain from the surgery began to recede, replaced by a strange, buzzing energy. I felt like I was waking up from a long sleep. I blocked every single person Ben was connected to. I changed my email settings. I even considered getting a doorbell camera, just in case. But the psychological healing was harder. I found myself second-guessing my tone in those final texts. Was I too blunt? Should I have been softer? But then I would remember the way he talked to the police, the concerned boyfriend act, and the way his face twisted when he realized he'd lost. I realized that softness wouldn't have saved me. It would have only given him more room to maneuver. I started to see my aggression not as a flaw, but as a survival skill. In a world that constantly tries to soften women's boundaries into suggestions, being hard is the only way to stay whole. I went back to the Reddit thread one last time before I decided to delete the app for a while. I saw a message in my inbox from a woman who said she was 45, child-free, and had gone through a similar breakup in her 30s. She wrote, "The silence you're feeling right now, that isn't loneliness, that's peace. And the man who tried to take it from you didn't do it because he loved you. He did it because he was afraid of a woman he couldn't control. Enjoy your dead end, honey." It's the most beautiful view in the world. I felt a tear prick my eye. I wasn't alone. I was part of a tribe of women who had looked at the traditional path and said, "No, thank you." I was part of a movement of people who realized that a life lived for oneself is not a wasted life. But as I finally started to feel like the worst was over, I received a package in the mail. No return address, just a small padded envelope that felt far too light to be anything substantial. My heart began to race again. I took it to the kitchen counter, my hands trembling as I reached for the scissors. I thought I had blocked every way he could reach me. I thought the police intervention was the final chapter. But as I cut open the envelope and let the contents slide onto the granite, I realized that some people don't just want to be heard, they want to leave a mark. The envelope felt weightless, like it was filled with nothing but air and a bad omen. I stood in my kitchen, the midday sun streaming through the window, casting a long, sharp shadow of the scissors across the counter. My breath was hitched in my throat. I had thought the police visit was the end of it. I had thought that seeing the law step in would be the bucket of cold water Ben needed to snap out of his delusion. But as I slid the blade through the paper, I realized that for some people, a boundary isn't a wall, it's a challenge. I tilted the envelope, and something small and soft tumbled out onto the granite. It was a pair of baby socks, tiny, knitted, pristine white wool. They looked innocent, even sweet, sitting there next to my coffee mug. But in the context of the last 2 weeks, they felt like a threat. They felt like a physical manifestation of the guilt Ben had been trying to drown me in since that 5th date. There was no note, no return address, just those 2 small pieces of clothing that represented the one thing I had explicitly said I would never provide. I felt a wave of nausea wash over me. This wasn't a gift. It was a psychological barb. It was his way of saying, I'm still here. I'm still watching you. I'm still mourning the you that I wanted. I picked up one of the socks with 2 fingers, as if it were contaminated. I thought about the sheer level of effort it took to go to a store, buy these, pack them, and mail them to someone who had blocked you on every platform. It wasn't an act of love. It was an act of spite. He wanted me to look at these socks and feel a pang of loss. He wanted me to regret my surgery. He wanted me to feel like a dead end. But as I stood there, holding that tiny piece of wool, something inside me shifted. The fear didn't disappear, but it crystallized into a cold, hard resolve. I wasn't going to be the broken woman he wanted me to be. I wasn't going to spend my recovery looking over my shoulder, waiting for the next layered message from a man who viewed my body as a debate topic. I walked over to the trash can and dropped the socks inside. No hesitation, no what ifs, just the sound of the lid clicking shut. I realized then that Ben's biggest mistake, the mistake that so many people make when they try to fix a child-free woman, was thinking that my choice was based on a lack of imagination. He thought that if he could just show me the beauty of motherhood, if he could just make me see the potential, I'd suddenly wake up. He didn't understand that I had already seen it. I had imagined the kids, the house, the natural transition into motherhood, and I had looked at the perfect life he was offering and realized it would be a prison for my soul. I called Sarah. When she arrived 20 minutes later, she didn't even say anything. She just saw the empty envelope on the counter and the look in my eyes. "We're going to the station," she said. "Not the non-emergency line this time. We're filing for a protective order." The process of filing for a restraining order is one of the most dehumanizing experiences a person can go through. You have to sit in a drab office and explain to a stranger why a nice guy who bought you pasta 5 times is now a threat to your peace of mind. You have to show them the texts, the burner account messages, and now the baby socks. The clerk looked at the socks. I'd fished them out of the trash and put them in a Ziploc bag, and then looked at me. "He sent these after the police told him to stay away?" she asked. "Yes," I said, my voice finally steady. "He calls me aggressive for saying no, but he thinks it's perfectly normal to mail baby clothes to a woman who just had surgery to ensure she never has children." The clerk nodded, her expression softening. "It's not about the socks, honey. It's about the fact that he won't stop trying to get inside your head." That was the key. Ben didn't want my body anymore. He knew that was a dead end. He wanted my sanity. He wanted to live in the back of my mind, a nagging voice of should have and could have. He wanted to be the ghost that haunted my freedom. As I signed the paperwork, I felt a strange sense of finality. This was the ultimate aggressive line. I was using the full weight of the legal system to say that my no was non-negotiable. A few days later, the order was served. I didn't see Ben's reaction, but I heard about it through the grapevine. Apparently, he was devastated. He told mutual acquaintances that I was unstable and that he was just trying to help me through a difficult time. He played the role of the jilted, worried lover until the very end. But it didn't matter. The messages stopped. The knocks stopped. The mail stayed empty of tiny wool socks. I spent the next month focusing on my real life. I went back to work. I went back to the gym. I went on a solo trip to the coast where I sat on a balcony overlooking the ocean and drank wine in a silence that felt like a symphony. I looked at the families on the beach, the crying toddlers, the stressed-out parents, the sheer chaos of it all, and I didn't feel judgment. I just felt relief. I felt like a traveller who had narrowly missed a train to a destination they never wanted to visit. I thought back to the Reddit post that started it all. AITAH for the way I handled the situation. The internet had its opinions. Ben had his opinions. Society has its opinions. But as I sat there, breathing in the salt air, I realised that the only opinion that mattered was mine. I wasn't the arsehole for being clear. I wasn't the arsehole for being firm. I wasn't the arsehole for protecting my future. The real arsehole in any story is the person who thinks their desire for you is more important than your desire for yourself. The real villain is the person who calls your boundaries aggressive because they can't climb over them. I'm 30 years old now, and I've never been more certain of who I am. My life isn't a dead end. It's a vast, open road, and I'm the only one with the map. I have a career I love, friends who are my true family, and a peace of mind that no nice guy with a navy sweater can ever take away again. So, if you're listening to this and you're facing a Ben, someone who thinks your no is just a maybe in disguise, I want you to remember one thing. You don't owe anyone a layered conversation about your own soul. You don't owe anyone a compromise on your future. And you certainly don't owe anyone a proper ending if they refuse to respect the beginning of your boundaries. Be aggressive, be cold, be a dead end for anyone who doesn't see you as a whole person. Because at the end of the day, you're the one who has to live in your skin. Make sure it's a place you actually want to be. What would you have done in my shoes? Would you have met him for that one last talk? Or would you have shut the door like I did? And have you ever had someone try to fix a choice you were perfectly happy with? Let me know in the comments. I'd love to hear how you handled your own Ben. And if you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe for more real-life accounts of people standing their ground.